Welcome back to the Rational Nationalist. I'm your host, Lee Ellis, and this week we'll talk about a general thread that runs through a number of things we discuss on this show, such as concept creep and the organizational bloat we've discussed the past 2 weeks. I don't think it's a stretch to say that people tend to exaggerate. We're all familiar with so-called fishtales, and with the office coworker who's facing one melodrama after another. This hypothetical coworker is actually a good place to start our conversation, which is where, when, and why people exaggerate the problems they face. This is done for a number of reasons, none of which are mutually exclusive, and many of which may be at play in any given situation of overstatement. Some are subconscious, some are intentional or unintentional, some exaggerations are malicious, and some may even be beneficial. Going back to our coworker Kenny, I was actually a little unfair to our hypothetical colleague. We actually don't know much about them other than that they have a problem. Great. We all have problems. So what? Is their concern an actual problem, or is this person exactly as dramatic as I opined earlier? Is this actually something we need to worry about? Let's step out of our shoes and put on Kenny's mind for a moment. The first thing that happened is that Kenny saw something he decided was a problem. How big a problem is inherently subjective. But Kenny, he doesn't have a bird's eye view of the situation. Kenny is Kenny. This is where evolution kicks in and drives people to instinctively overreact. First off, people tend to see problems where potentially there are none. It's not hard to see why this would be beneficial from an evolutionary perspective. If you're out on the Serengeti and you see something rustling in the leaves, you blast the shit out of it first and then you ask questions later. People who overreact to potential threats and eliminate them with prejudice survive, even if sometimes the rustling was just the wind or a small child. This is the first of many problems we'll encounter in today's episode, and one of the biggest reasons for the saying, the biggest asshole always wins. Likewise, we might be oversensitive to particular problems or issues due either to nature or nurture or mistake of fact. However, even once we've accurately assessed the situation and determined all the facts, hypothetically, I'll grant that we're even fairly certain of what the facts are, we don't know exactly how big the problem is. We know what it is, but it could cause issues down the road, or it could end up being nothing. How do we evaluate how much time and attention to devote to this problem? At this point, we may consciously add a buffer zone. It's safer to assume and prepare for the worst, so we take our evaluation of the problem and add a little for safe measure. Back to Kenny, you have to remember that however big the problem is, it is Kenny's problem. Naturally, we prioritize our own problems before those of others. For example, normally I'll help you put your house out if it's on fire, but if my house is also on fire is because the Mongols are invading and all our houses are on fire, then good luck getting water. In other words, the problem will appear bigger to Kenny than to other people because of Kenny's perspective. This is where things start to feed into one another in a complex, chaotic system, and the dividing lines we drew in our windmill graphic become somewhat arbitrary as perception blends into ego needs, and ego needs blend into social needs. See, we're all pretty clear on why our problems appear bigger to us than other people's problems. However, we also convince ourselves that our problems are more important, and sometimes we internalize our own hype. There are a number of factors at play here, so let's keep it grounded with our good friend Kenny. Kenny at this point has evaluated the problem, assessed it, and has an accurate view of the problem. Now he has to solve the problem, possibly with some help from others, because again, it's his problem to solve and his job to take care of whatever the problem is. Let's face it, nobody likes to think of themselves as an insignificant worm crawling through a meaningless existence. I mean, other than nihilists and 14-year-olds trying to be edgy, nobody likes to think of themselves this way. We like to think our lives have meaning, that what we do matters. People don't like being told their jobs could be done by trained monkeys, or that nobody would notice if they didn't show, though the benefits of a job like that are obvious to many other of us. Now, many of us think of, for example, the USPS, the United States Postal Service investigative unit, as being the first line of defense against terrorism, but that was how Ed Helms, postal investigator on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, saw things. Now, all of this is theoretically still internal. Still, it only really matters, anything in the real world only really matters when a person articulates this to another, what they do or how they think of themselves. In other words, when somebody talks about their problems to some other person. After all, none of our internal dialogue actually matters until we put words into the air, or pen to paper, or finger to keyboard, or whatever communication system we choose to articulate those internal thoughts. Now, at this point, it's unclear how big the problem actually is. In other words, do we believe Kenny's assessment of the problem, or do we think he's exaggerating a bit, or even outright lying? It's worth noting that even at this point, the lines between perception and ego needs are blurred. It's unclear how warped Kenny's sense of self-importance is, though assuming he's a typical baseline human being, it's safe to assume it's fairly warped. Still, he's likely internalized a lot of the exaggerations needed to satisfy his ego needs, so he probably really believes what he's saying about the importance of the problems he deals with, though there may be some self-awareness that he's chest-thumping for others, especially towards the margins. Nevertheless, we know that Kenny has incentives to exaggerate aside from simply soothing his ego. We're now going to assume that we're the person listening to Kenny and trying to evaluate his veracity. The first thing we're going to wonder is if Kenny's a drama king. We all know that person for whom every molehill is a mountain, and their constant complaints seem to escalate with the lack of attention each receives, a vicious cycle since nobody takes anything they say seriously at this point anyway. However, we know nothing about Kenny, so we assume he's a baseline human being. What incentive could he possibly have for making his problems out to be bigger than they seem? Now, I could probably stop the podcast here and have you spend the rest of the time coming up with possibilities of your own. Once you start thinking about it like that, the floodgates open. So we'll start with a transitionary one between the ego needs of Kenny and his social needs. Remember how we said that people exaggerate their problems so that they feel important? How much more do you think people care about seeming important and interesting to others? We might be okay recognizing our own irrelevance to ourselves, but the moment somebody asks us what we do for a living, we don't want to tell them we sit around smoking weed and playing video games. We tell them that we form intellectual frameworks that help people conceptualize abstract concepts in a practical manner, or some other bullshit to hide how unimportant we really are. We're basically describing the same activity in both circumstances, but one sounds better to the Bible study crowd than the other. It's not just that we want to impress others. People, for some reason I've yet to understand, like being the center of attention. There's probably some pretty simple evolutionary explanation here that I'm too lazy to care about, but this is the whole idea behind birthday parties and so on. There's a very real emotional and probably physiological reaction when all eyes are on you, captivated by your every word. Furthermore, remember Captain Complainy from earlier? That cousin who always has some overly dramatic problem they were droning on and on about? Well, probably part of the reason they do that is that if they didn't, nobody would care about their problems. I mean, nobody cares anyway, but the point is that their problems are often so insignificant that they have to exaggerate to get anybody to give a damn. Again, it's for attention. Okay, so we've talked about the individual's social and ego needs sort of melding into each other with a fair amount of overlap, and now the interest of the individual and their presentation of the problem to the world begins to seep into the external or real world in a chaos theory type of potentially exponential exaggeration. I say potentially because most of the time it fizzles out with the individual and goes nowhere, which is why it's so difficult to get people to care about your problems. Can you begin to see where I'm going with this? Not all of this is done simply out of ego, the colloquial usage of the term. It's very often strategic. People may exaggerate specific aspects of the problem relevant to their target audience or overstate the problem to secure funding for their particular research. You can see why this is a particular problem in the scientific community. Anyone who's followed COVID and some of the resulting cover-ups and fallout closely can see this in practice firsthand. It's also easy to justify such exaggerations when they're for a good cause, as they often are. After all, you're just trying to get people to do what they should be doing anyway, right? What's the problem with that? Well, turns out there are a couple of problems. See, we all know the story of the boy who cried wolf, right? Sensationalism, or overplaying one's hand by exaggerating the extent of the problem they're seeking assistance for, is a double-edged sword. You might get people to join your cause or rally to your side in the short term or for immediate action. However, when you go to this well too often, eventually people start to tune you out. Remember how in vogue the environmental movement was just a few years ago? Al Gore was raking it in on an inconvenient truth. John Kerry was private jetting across the world with Leonardo DiCaprio, and AOC was storming into Congress with her Green New Deal. Now it seems like the wind has left the sails, so to speak. Even Greta Thunberg has had to find a new cause in Palestinian activism to keep her celebrity status. What happened? A couple of things, including the obvious hypocrisy of burning Teslas while mandating electric stoves over gas, but they all come down to one simple common thread: they overplayed their hand. Going back to the early 1990s, when the scientific community first came to consensus on man-made global warming, the environmental movement has done everything they can to play up the severity of the problem to the general public, ultimately overstating the severity of the issue and losing faith of the general public with their heavy-handed tactics in doing so. For example, the publication The Liberal Patriot went under, in part due to sabotage from environmental activists as retribution for the publication's refusal to unquestioningly go along with the Green Party line. That's green, small g for environmental, not capital G as in having anything to do with the Green Party, the political party. Anyone who wants more of this particular issue can read John Halpin's first-hand accounts on the issue, at least what he's said publicly, but self-righteousness has ultimately been the downfall of the environmental movement. When the initial assessment of the scientific community wasn't enough to spur action, they began to take it upon themselves, rather than allowing the democratic process to play out in a way that they found to be wrong, to overstate the problem by pushing the most extreme forecasts. They worked to bury contradictory evidence, and if you know anything about science, the evidence almost never all points one way: to silence dissenters and attribute every environmental disaster, no matter how tenuously connected, to climate change. And remember, weather systems are complex and chaotic, so definitively establishing any cause and effect is nearly impossible. As a result of this overreach, the general public has largely turned against an environmental movement that seems more interested in throwing soup on paintings and blocking traffic than making change. As noted, most environmental celebrities have moved on to new causes to keep their 15 minutes of fame. And notice that none of it, has to do with the underlying legitimacy of the environmental cause. The underlying issue of man-made climate change still exists, is still a serious issue, and is still unresolved. However, by becoming overly focused on their own power, influence, and celebrity, the environmental movement has undermined its own cause. It's not the first, and it won't be the last. Many worthwhile causes have been undermined by the human ego. This also brings us into the last line to blur on our windmill: the difference between social needs and the external societal narrative. Just to start by distinguishing these two in theory. The social needs are added by the initial person for their own benefit, and the external narrative then gets added by third parties, such as the media or others, when that initial person loses control of the narrative, so to speak. You've already seen this happen to an extent with the environmental movement. Al Gore got the ball rolling with environmental doomsdayism, and then everyone who wanted to come in after needed to make more dramatic and more apocalyptic predictions. Eventually, this got taken to an extreme, which is ultimately what led to the possibly temporary downfall of environmental activism, and to be fair, the election of Trump didn't exactly help. However, this doesn't just happen within a movement, it happens between movements. The environmental movement oversells the looming environmental disaster to get people off their asses. No harm, no foul, kind of, for the reasons we've discussed. Actually, quite a bit of harm and quite a bit of foul. But, people probably should be doing more to help the environment, so I guess it kind of works out. Unfortunately, society has a limited number of resources, and we just made a major investment in environmentalism because we just saw the new documentary, and are soiling ourselves out of fear. Environmentalists are all celebrating and high-fiving, but you know who else is watching? Everyone else. Everybody with any cause, any issue, or any problem has an incentive to overstate the severity of their problem to draw attention and gain support. Worse, everybody almost has to lie at this point simply to compensate for everybody else's exaggerations. If you were honest, after all, the accurate statement of your problem would be dwarfed by everybody else's tall tales. The result is an arms race of exaggeration between various lobbies and causes, all seeking to draw attention to their pet causes. Notice this isn't the environmentalists' fault at all. In fact, at this point, we could easily substitute literally any other group in their place. I'm just holding them over from the specific example we looked at earlier. This arms race of hyperbole inevitably occurs in all settings, whether within societies, organizations, or even smaller units like families or local communities. It's just human nature. And this is where the chaos theory of human society sets in. Pretend you have a problem. Maybe it's legit, maybe it's not, maybe oversell it, maybe you start out honestly and with the best of intentions. Doesn't really matter. You start an organization to address the problem. Say it's something simple and uncontroversial like feeding starving orphan kids. How else can you feed the starving orphan kids? You can't, is my point, so starting this organization isn't a bad thing. It's literally helping feed starving orphan kids, which is the most unobjectionable, purely good cause I could come up with. This organization is super successful to the point that there are no more starving orphan kids. Great, so you pack it up, call it a day, and go home, disbanding the organization that's now served its mission, right? Maybe. I mean, that's certainly an option in some organizations, especially campaigns, political and charitable, do just this. Others, buoyed by success but not weighed down by ego or corruption, morph. They fought one cause, they fed the starving orphan kids, now they're feeding the starving kids with parents. Why not? The first cause went so well that they broadened their mission and found more social ills to tackle. Good for them. However, all these organizations have payrolls, employees, and the vast majority of these charitable organizations convey power, influence, and social status on their leaders. They also aren't all ethical. I mean, if the Catholic Church can molest a bunch of kids, then even the organizations that seem to have the best intentions are capable of great corruption. This is one of the key drivers of concept creep, one of our favorite common threads. Let's just pick a random example. Say you form an organization to fight child abuse. You succeed, and fewer people are beating their children with belts. However, you've been expanding through successful marketing campaigns. Everyone thinks you're a local hero, and you just doubled your organization's payroll to double your impact. What do? Assuming you're corrupt as hell, which I should have noted is the case here, you want to keep this charitable empire you've built. You have a couple of options. You can expand the definition of child abuse from belt beatings to timeouts, and if you still don't have enough cases to combat, you can expand it even farther to include harsh talkings too. This is how concept creep sets in on a society-wide level. You can also look harder for cases, pursuing cases on flimsier and flimsier evidence until you're attacking child abusers on nothing more than rumors in the wind. Or you could fabricate things straight up. You don't even need to know about it firsthand. All you have to do is provide the right incentives to employees, say, pay them based on the accusations they make or the cases they bring or whatever, and the problem solves itself through incentives without you needing to dirty your hands at the top. It doesn't even have to be an organization doing this. These same processes occur within a single individual activist or crusader as they go looking for more and more opportunities to confirm this self-image, both to themselves and others. This is how well-intentioned individuals end up charging at literal windmills of their own creation. Thank you for joining us on the Rational Nationalist. I've been your host, Ellis, signing off.